Hello everybody, welcome back to Reaper Minis TV. Hope you enjoyed last episode where we looked at our Warriors of Chaos army built using Reaper miniatures, but for this time we're going to get right into reviews. First up we have two miniatures from the P65 line. This first one is Pachylox, an elephant man, and you can see it here in the blister, the weapon that he's carrying. It's a very large, heavy, two-handed axe, it looks like to me, and you can see that it's bent in the package. So when I get him out of here, I'm going to have to address that, fix it, maybe pin it, at least glue it to give it a little bit of stability. So just be careful if yours looks this way also. Okay, and we'll go ahead and cut him out of the blister now, and try to be careful because my X-Acto knife skills are always a little bit suspect. And not too bad of a job opening up a plastic container there, so good for me. And getting the pieces out, you see we have the bulk of the figure here, and then two tusks that are on a sprue by themselves, so we'll clip those off of there when we assemble the figure. And try to get focused in on the tusks. And then here's the bulk of the figure. He's on what would be a cavalry size base. So if you wanted to put him on a 25mm base, and that's something I'm thinking of, you could clip him off because only his only his left foot is on the base. You could easily drop that onto a 25mm base if you wanted to use him in, say, a Warriors of Chaos army as a mutated hero of chaos. Now his weapon, I was able to bend it back into place fairly straight. Did not break it, but I am going to glue it. I don't really want to break it to pin it to fix it, so I'm going to apply some Gorilla super glue to it. Hopefully that'll fix it and keep it all steady. It's not like I'm going to be throwing him around or anything. But you can see details on the figure are good. He's got pouches on him. He's got a couple skulls as trophies, rushing forward with, I guess what you'd call an elephant's war cry. Does need a little bit of cleaning, but overall a very cool looking figure that, for me, you already guessed it, he's going to go into my Warriors of Chaos army. And our next figure also comes from the P65 line. This is a Reptus dragon turtle, and a friend of mine uses this in an orc and goblin army as a mount for an orc lord. So it's got some uses there beyond just Warlord or your typical fantasy games. And we're going to also try our cutting skills to bust him out of his blister. And there we go. Got a big, heavy amount of pieces that we're dumping out here, and we'll go through looking at each of them. Here's the tortoise, the shell of the dragon turtle, and this is the underside. You've got part of the head and mouth and neck there. You got a couple of, you have 4 legs, 2 front legs, 2 rear legs. You have the top of the head and then a tail. And I'm not going to go through the complete assembly here just because that would take a while, but here you can see the shell. 2 halves fit together. It's hollow inside, so definitely going to weigh less than it normally would if it was a solid piece, but it's still pretty darn hefty. And you can see where you've got the various openings to put the rest of the pieces in. Legs are going to slot in to some void and slot joints on either side. And it stands up fairly tall on the battlefield. It's a pretty impressive figure. And like I said, a friend of mine uses it in an orc army, and it looks pretty imposing, especially because he's got a rider on there. Now, I'd probably have to spend some more time to really get it put together, because I'm not exactly sure right here on busting it out of the blister how it goes together. I'm probably fumbling it up pretty good here. But it's an impressive figure. It would look good in a subterranean game. Maybe you could find it in the Underdark somewhere. That'd be a good monster to fight. Or you could use it in a couple different applications. You could use it in Warlord as part of a Reptus army, or as a very unique mount for a player character or general or hero type in a mass combat game. Okay, we're going to move into the Savage Worlds realm for a little bit here, and we've got a female Indian Shaman. This is a single piece miniature. You can see that she's carrying a tomahawk in one hand and a staff in the other. Details are all really good. The figure is a little bit flat. It doesn't have a very dynamic pose to it, but details are good on the figure. Face is well done. All of her little trinkets and bits of armor that she has and everything are sculpted nicely, so no real flaws to the figure or anything like that. It just does seem a little bit of a flat or plain pose to me. And now into the Warlord line for a second, we have Gilok Onyxfist. He's a wizard of the Kragmar faction for Warlord. And for Warhammer players, a Dwarf Wizard, or the idea of a Dwarf Wizard, seems a little bit strange because at best they're runesmiths. They don't use normal spell casting, but in Warlord or D&D or other fantasy games, a Dwarf Wizard is perfectly legitimate. So you've got him here as a single-piece miniature. He's in a very dynamic casting pose where he's bracing himself and he's putting his hands together to cast forth some kind of spell. You could sort of imagine a fireball coming forth out of his hands where they're clasped together there. So, very cool figure. I like it a lot. I kind of wish that he didn't have a bald head, that he had a big flowing kind of wild mane of hair, but maybe that's just me. Overall, I like the figure. I think he'd do well as a PC in anything but Warhammer, but that still leaves you with a lot of good uses for him. And now onto the Chronoscope line, we have a Shoggoth, and this is a single-piece miniature, and if you're familiar with works of H.P. Lovecraft, Call of Cthulhu, things like that, you're probably pretty familiar at least with Shoggoth as a thing, maybe not exactly how it looks. This one here is probably the size of, if you flattened out 2 or 3 humanoid figures and mashed them all up, that's about how big this is. So it's not as large as the room-encompassing or house-encompassing giant Shoggoth that you might think of in Call of Cthulhu terms, but it is a mass of writhing tentacles and eyes sticking out, probably dozens of eyes here on the figure, and then the big central orb in the center, but it's still a very good tentacly horror kind of monster. So maybe it's a little Shoggoth before it's devoured a town or started to devour a town and grown into a big giant Shoggoth. I don't know. But as a creature for you to use in a horror game or as some kind of slimy, tentacly dungeon dweller, I think it works really, really well. And then in the Dark Heaven Legends line, we have a couple of other horrible or horrific figures, depending on how you want to look at them. These are 2 Blabbling Horrors, and we saw these in a video from ReaperCon this year when I was taking video of the display cabinets. These were in there, and they just hadn't been released yet. But you get 2 figures in this blister pack, and they're hollow on the inside, so they're not as heavy as a big blob of lead, but you can see there's these contorted faces that are screaming and full of teeth and with anguished looks on their faces or on their multiple faces here, and these are just ugly little blobs of flesh and faces that are going to come and chew on your player characters. So very good for a horror game, very good, like the Shoggoth, in some deep, dank dungeon where God knows what's going to come out and get you. So, cool little monsters here, and I can probably find a use for them. And then our last figure for this episode is the next fellow from the Legion of Justice and Cake that Reaper is doing, and this is Shoatima. I think I'm saying that right, Shoatima. And it is an otter that is armed with a bow and arrow, so he's a ranger. It's a single-piece miniature, and I had a little bit of a problem right off the bat with mine, so you want to watch out if you're going to pick this up in your local game store. The top part of the bow and the arrow were bent to heck in the blister when I got it. So you'll need to carefully get those back into place if they're bent at all, being very careful not to break them or damage the figure in any way. He's carrying plenty of extra gear. There's a belt around his waist, or what would be the waist for an otter. He has a necklace that has a shell on it, a quiver with extra arrows, pouches, and things like that. And it's a very characterful figure. He's got his tongue sticking out, and he's sort of like biting on his tongue as he's taking aim at whatever he's going to shoot at. So it's a cute-looking figure. I think it would go along well with the mouselings. It's not really intended to be a mouseling or in the group of mouselings, but as those cutesy kind of characters, I think he does real well. Alright everybody, thanks for watching this episode of Reaper Minis TV. We'll see you next time with more reviews.